The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the northern wilderness in a frozen silence. In the depths of Canada's Northwest Territories, the land stretched endlessly in all directions, a brutal expanse of ice, forests, and rivers that few dared to call home. But one man had settled here, building a small log cabin along the Rat River. No one knew where he had come from, only that he had arrived, silent and alone, and had begun trapping in the dense woods. The locals called him Albert Johnson, though there was no way to know if that was his real name. He spoke little, if at all, and made no effort to befriend the few who crossed his path. As the weeks passed, reports came in from trappers that someone had been sabotaging their traps, springing them and leaving them useless. Suspicion fell on Johnson. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police sent a constable to question him, but when they arrived at his cabin, the man refused to speak. He didn't acknowledge their presence, standing motionless inside his hut as the officers pounded on the door. It was an eerie sight, the silent figure watching through the frosted window, his breath fogging against the cold glass. Without legal grounds to force their way inside, the officers returned to town, but they would not leave him be for long. Days later, the Mounties came back, this time armed with a search warrant. When they knocked, there was no answer. The wind howled through the trees, and the frost clung to their coats. One officer moved forward, putting his shoulder into the door, pushing against the stubborn wood. That was when the first shot rang out. A bullet ripped through the door and struck one of the officers, sending him staggering back, blood staining the pristine snow. Johnson had opened fire without warning, and the Mounties, caught off guard, had no choice but to retreat. The wounded officer was rushed back to civilization, barely clinging to life, while the others regrouped. Johnson had drawn first blood, and now the hunt was on. The Mounties returned, this time in force. 9 men, armed and determined, surrounded the cabin. They called out to Johnson, demanding surrender, but the man remained silent. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they moved into position, and then, with a blast that echoed through the valley, they detonated dynamite against the cabin walls. The explosion sent shards of wood and ice flying in all directions. But as the smoke cleared, something impossible happened. From beneath the ruins, Johnson began shooting. He had survived the blast, dug himself a trench within his own home, and now he was picking them off with deadly accuracy. He was a ghost in the snow, an unrelenting shadow, and when the gunfire ceased, he was gone. What followed was one of the greatest manhunts in Canadian history. Johnson vanished into the wilderness, moving with a speed and endurance that defied all logic. The Mounties tracked him for weeks, following his prints through frozen rivers and dense forests, but no matter how close they got, he always slipped away. He did not make fires. He left no sign of struggle, no discarded supplies. He seemed to live off nothing, surviving in temperatures that should have killed any man. The locals whispered that he wasn't human, that he was something else entirely, a being not bound by the same rules of flesh and bone. The chase took on an eerie rhythm. The Mounties followed Johnson's trail through waist-deep snow, across icy rivers, and up steep, unforgiving cliffs. More than once, they found themselves forced to turn back as the cold became unbearable, while Johnson pressed forward, untouched by the elements. At times, they would come across his makeshift shelters, hastily constructed hideouts that provided just enough cover to shield him from the relentless wind. But even in these, there were no remnants of fire, no scraps of food. It was as if he required nothing to sustain him. Twice they managed to corner him, each time convinced that the chase was over. Each time, Johnson slipped away like a wraith, using the landscape itself to his advantage. He waded through chest-deep snow without slowing, climbed treacherous slopes where no sane man would tread, and doubled back on his tracks, weaving a web of deception that confounded even the most skilled trackers. The Mounties' dogs, trained to follow a scent to the ends of the earth, grew weary, their paws cracked and bleeding from the brutal terrain. Men who had spent their lives in the wilderness spoke in hushed voices of the mad trapper's almost supernatural resilience. Then, in a fateful confrontation along the Eagle River, the Mounties caught up with him. He was waiting, rifle in hand, his cold eyes watching them from the shadows of the trees. The snow was deep, and Johnson, for the first time, was at a disadvantage. His movements were slower, and as the officers closed in, the final shot was fired. Johnson fell into the snow, his blood staining the white landscape, his body still at last. When they searched him, they found no identification, no letters, no records. His pockets were lined with cash, an absurd amount for a lone trapper. His teeth showed signs of advanced dental work, the kind usually reserved for the wealthy. There was no logical explanation for how he had survived as long as he did, no reason why his endurance had outlasted the best trackers in the region. In the aftermath, theories swirled. Some believed he had been a wanted criminal from the United States, fleeing a past so dark that he would rather die than be caught. Others speculated he was an ex-military man, trained in survival beyond normal human capability. A few whispered that he was something beyond human, a spectral figure, a wanderer from another place, a being whose origins would never be known. Scientists years later examined his remains, searching for clues through DNA, but even those results were inconclusive. His fingerprints matched no records, and no family ever came forward to claim him. Some speculated that he had been a spy, working for an unknown government, using the northern wilderness as a place to disappear. His lack of identification, his silence, and his combat skills suggested he had experience in evasion. Others pointed to the gold fillings in his teeth, something common among European aristocracy or wealthy individuals. Had he abandoned a life of privilege for the harsh embrace of the wild? One particularly strange theory suggested he was an escapee from a top-secret experiment, a man enhanced or altered in ways science had yet to comprehend. Even in death, he was a mystery, a legend carved into the ice. The mad trapper of Rat River was gone, but the questions he left behind would haunt the land forever, a specter of the North, a man who belonged to no history but his own. And as the decades passed, stories of him only grew. Some claimed to have seen his ghost wandering the desolate trails where he had once fled. Others whispered that somewhere deep within the forests, a man just like him still moved in the shadows, avoiding civilization, watching, waiting. His legend refused to fade, and in the lonely, frozen reaches of the North, some still wondered, had he ever truly died at all?